The day Lenora Morgan walked up the dirt road to the Hale ranch with nothing but a carpetbag in one hand and a dead husband's debts pressing down on her shoulders, she was not looking for love, she was looking for survival. The Texas panhandle in the spring of 1882 was not a forgiving place. The wind came down from the north with a particular cruelty that month, carrying red dust that settled in the creases of a person's skin and stained the whites of their eyes. The sun, when it finally showed itself above the ridge, was the kind that bleached color from things, from dresses, from wood, from hope. Lenora had ridden the last 11 miles on the back of a borrowed wagon that belonged to the general store owner in the town of Calico Flat, a stout man named Burl Watkins, who had been kind enough not to ask too many questions when she climbed up beside him on the bench seat and said she was headed to the Hale spread. She was 31 years old. Her hair, which had once been the deep copper brown of polished saddle leather, now had a strand or two of silver near her left temple that she had earned honestly through 2 winters of hard circumstance. Her eyes were the color of green river water in late summer, clear and still, and carrying more beneath the surface than most people expected. She was not a fragile woman. She had calluses on her palms from hauling water and splitting kindling, and a set to her jaw that people in Calico Flat described as determined, when they were being charitable, and stubborn when they were not. Her husband, Thomas Morgan, had died 7 months prior. A horse had thrown him on a particularly rocky stretch of land north of their homestead, and he had broken his neck so cleanly that the doctor said he likely felt nothing. Lenora was not sure if that was meant to comfort her or not. What she did feel was the sudden collapse of everything they had tried to build together. Thomas had been a decent man, not a great one. He had made promises with the confidence of a man who believed his luck would eventually turn, and he had borrowed against the small parcel of land they owned to fund a cattle venture that had gone badly wrong when a fever swept through the herd the previous autumn. By the time Lenora had put Thomas in the ground and sorted through his papers, she found that the land was nearly gone, swallowed up by the debt owed to a bank in Amarillo that had no interest in sentiment. She had spent the winter taking in mending and washing for the families in Calico Flat, and she had done it without complaint, but the money was not enough. The bank had sent a letter in February and another in March, and the language in the second letter made it clear that spring would bring a reckoning. A neighbor woman named Hazel Prout, who had a daughter married to one of the hands at the Hale ranch, told Lenora that Elijah Hale was a fair employer and that he ran a proper operation out on the Sweetwater River Flats, some 11 miles from town. He had more land than any 3 other ranchers in the county combined, a herd of nearly 400 cattle, and a bunkhouse that his foreman managed with an iron hand. Hazel had said, "He pays honest wages, and he does not chase his female help around the kitchen, which is more than you can say for some." That had been enough for Lenora. She had packed the carpetbag, settled her account with the boarding house, and climbed up on Burl Watkins's wagon before the sun was properly above the horizon. The Hale ranch appeared to her first as a smudge against the wide flat sky, a cluster of buildings that grew more defined as the wagon rolled down the packed earth road. There was a main house, built from the kind of substantial timber that had to have been hauled a considerable distance, with a long front porch that ran the entire width of the structure, and a second-floor window that caught the afternoon light like a lantern. Beside it stood a cookhouse, a barn of serious proportions, 2 corrals, and then set back about 40 yards to the east and built from rougher, more honest lumber, the bunkhouse. Burl Watkins pulled his wagon to a stop near the bunkhouse and told her he would wait 10 minutes and no more, as he had deliveries to make. Lenora thanked him, straightened her back, picked up her carpetbag and walked to the bunkhouse door. She knocked. There was a long pause, and then the door opened, and Lenora Morgan found herself looking at Elijah Hale for the first time. He was 34 years old, broad through the chest and shoulders in the way of a man who had spent his entire adult life doing physical work rather than merely supervising it. His hair was dark brown, nearly black, and it had the disheveled quality of a man who had recently taken off his hat. His jaw was clean-shaved, which was notable in that part of Texas where most men wore their beards as a kind of informal biography of their hardship, and his eyes were a deep, quiet gray, the color of the sky in the hour before a proper rainstorm. He was holding a piece of rope that he had apparently been mending, and he looked at her with an expression of such complete and genuine surprise that Lenora nearly smiled. "Good afternoon," she said, because it was, by about a quarter of an hour. "My name is Lenora Morgan. I am a widow from Calico Flat. I am looking for work, and I am told by Hazel Prout that you employ domestic help." Elijah Hale stared at her for a moment that lasted just slightly too long to be entirely comfortable. Then he opened the door wider and said, "You had better come inside." The bunkhouse was clean in the way that a place kept by practical men is clean, functional, ordered, without any attention paid to aesthetics. There were 6 wooden bunks along the far wall, a long table in the center with benches on either side, a stove in the corner, and a row of pegs near the door hung with hats and oilskin coats. 3 of the bunks were made up with rough gray blankets. The other 3 were empty. The room smelled of wood smoke and leather, and the particular dusty smell that Texas always carried indoors along with its residents. Elijah Hale set the rope down on the table and looked at her with an expression that was careful and measuring but not unkind. "Hazel Prout," he said, "that would be the mother of Clara Moss." "That is right. Clara's husband, Pete Moss, works here, I believe. He does good hand." He pulled one of the bench seats out from the table and gestured for her to sit, and then he sat down across from her, folding his large hands on the table in front of him. "What kind of work are you looking for, Mrs. Morgan?" "Whatever work needs doing," she said. "I can cook. I can clean, so do laundry. I am a fair hand in a kitchen garden, and I know how to put up preserves and salt meat. I learn things quickly." She paused. "I am not looking for charity. I will work hard for fair wages." He looked at her steadily. "How long were you married?" 8 years. She met his eyes without flinching because she had learned in the 7 months since Thomas died that if she let herself look away when people asked personal questions, they tended to fill in the silence with pity, and she had no use for pity. "Any children?" "No, that one was harder." She held his gaze anyway. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, she could hear Burl Watkins's wagon shifting as his horse stamped against the flies. She had perhaps 8 minutes. "I have a cook," Elijah said. "Old fellow named Amos. He has been with me since my father's time, but Amos broke his wrist last month and he is not managing well. The men have been eating badly and nobody is happy about it." He looked at the table for a moment, then back at her. "I can offer you room and board and fair wages for kitchen work. The cookhouse has a small room attached to the back that was used as a pantry. It is not large, but it is private." He paused. "The men who work here are decent fellows, but I want it said plainly that they will respect your privacy or they will answer to me. That is not a concern you need to carry." Lenora felt something loosen in her chest that she had not realized she had been holding tight. "That is a fair arrangement," she said. "I accept." He nodded, and it struck her that he had not smiled yet, but that there was something in his face that was not quite seriousness, more like the expression of a man who had grown accustomed to keeping his warmth behind glass, where it was visible but protected. She turned and went to the door of the bunkhouse to call to Burl Watkins that she would not need the return trip after all. Burl tipped his hat, turned his horse, and was gone. It was as simple as that. She had arrived with a carpetbag and no particular future, and within the span of 15 minutes she had a place to sleep and wages coming. She did not know, standing in the door of that bunkhouse watching the wagon roll away, that she would leave this ranch with the deed to the main house and the last name of the quiet man who had just offered her a pantry room and protection. She did not know any of it. She was simply grateful for the job. The cookhouse was a long, low building with a wide hearth, a massive iron stove, and a work table that had been rubbed smooth by years of use. Amos, whose full name was Amos Beauchamp, was a man of about 60 who had the resigned dignity of someone who had accepted that his body was beginning to operate on its own terms regardless of what he preferred. His wrist was wrapped in cloth and he sat on a stool near the fire watching Lenora as she opened the provisions cupboard and took inventory with the practical efficiency of a woman who had been managing a household since she was 16. "You have a plan?" Amos asked. "I have a larder," she said. "That is enough to start." He laughed at that, a short, dry sound, and the ice between them broke cleanly. Amos was, she quickly discovered, not a man who relinquished control of his kitchen with any kind of ease, but he was also not a fool, and he recognized competence when he saw it. Within 3 days they had established a working arrangement that was entirely unspoken. She cooked, he advised, and he watched her with the attentive skepticism of a man deciding whether to trust someone with something precious. She made biscuits her first morning that were light enough to make the ranch hands go quiet in a way that said more than any compliment. She made a proper beef stew that second night that had enough salt and depth and warmth to make Pete Moss, who was not an expressive man, push his bowl forward and say, "More, please, ma'am," in a tone approaching reverence. Elijah Hale ate his meals at the cookhouse table with the rest of the men. This was, she learned from Amos, a habit that the previous cook had apparently fought against. The distinction between the owner's table and the worker's table was one that some men were particular about. Elijah was not. He sat at the end of the long table and ate what everyone else ate and was treated by his men with a straightforward respect that was clearly earned rather than performed. He did not say much to her directly during those first days. He was polite and precise. He thanked her for the meals and asked once whether the pantry room was comfortable, and accepted her answer that it was with a nod. But she noticed that he looked at her sometimes when he thought she was occupied, and that when he caught her looking back, he returned his attention to his plate with the same composure a man might use if he had simply been studying the weather. On the 4th day, a problem arrived in the form of a man named Devereaux. Cord Devereaux was not a ranch hand, but rather a representative of the Amarillo Bank and Trust, who had made the ride out from town wearing a suit that was too good for the dust it was collecting. He was about 40, with the smooth hands and calculating eyes of a man who made his living not with his body but with his words. He had come, apparently, on behalf of the bank, and when Elijah saw him ride up through the cookhouse window, something in the rancher's jaw tightened in a way that Lenora had not seen before. She stepped out of the cookhouse to refill the water bucket from the pump, and she could not help but hear the exchange on the porch. Devereaux was talking about water rights. There was a creek, the North Fork of the Sweetwater, that ran through the upper corner of Elijah's property, and Devereaux was suggesting, in the careful language of a man who had rehearsed his position, that the bank held the deed to a parcel of land that gave them certain claims on the creek's flow. He was suggesting, further, that a compromise might be reached if Elijah was willing to renegotiate the terms of a loan that his father had taken out years before. Elijah's voice was quiet and level when he answered. He said that the deed had been clear for 11 years, and that the water rights were not the bank's business, and that he would be consulting his attorney in Amarillo before any further discussion took place. Devereaux smiled in the way of a man who had a card he had not yet played. Elijah showed him off the property in a way that was entirely civil and entirely final. When Devereaux rode away, Elijah stood on the porch steps for a moment looking at the horizon with an expression that was controlled but heavy with something worry, she thought, or perhaps the particular brand of exhaustion that comes from fighting the same fight in a new form. She went back inside without saying anything, because it was not her place to speak. That evening, after the hands had eaten and gone to the bunkhouse, she was cleaning up when Elijah came back into the cookhouse and poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot she kept warm near the stove. He sat at the end of the table and did not immediately speak. Lenora continued washing the bowls and did not feel the need to fill the silence. After a while he said, "You heard what that man said today." "Some of it," she said. "He will come back. His kind always do." She set a bowl on the drying rack. "What will you do?" "What needs doing?" he said. "Ride to Amarillo, see the lawyer, make sure everything is documented the way it should be." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "It was my father's loan. He was not as careful with paperwork as he should have been." "Was your father still living when you took over the ranch?" "He died 6 years ago." A pause. "My mother a year before him." "I am sorry," she said, and meant it. He looked at her then with those gray eyes, and she saw something in them that he clearly did not intend to show, a kind of loneliness so deep and long-standing that it had almost become indistinguishable from character. "I appreciate it," he said, and stood, and took his coffee outside. Lenora dried the last bowl and stood for a moment in the warm cookhouse, listening to the evening sounds of the ranch, the cattle calling out somewhere beyond the north fence, the horses shifting in the barn, the distant murmur of the hands in the bunkhouse playing cards. She was not thinking about Elijah Hale in any particular way. She was simply noting, as a woman who had known a man for 8 years and could read the architecture of them, that he was carrying something heavy and doing it alone. The weeks that followed had the rhythm of genuine work, and Lenora found comfort in that rhythm in a way she had not expected. Her days began before dawn when she built up the cookhouse fire and started the coffee and began the biscuits, and they ended after supper when the last dish was clean, and she could sit in her small room off the back of the cookhouse and read by lamplight until her eyes gave out. She was good at her work, and the ranch responded to it in small ways. The hands were better fed and consequently better tempered. Amos's wrist was healing, and he had taken to sitting at the cookhouse table in the afternoons talking to her, while she prepared the evening meal, telling her about the history of the ranch, about Elijah's father William Hale, who had come out from Tennessee in 1858 and broken this land through sheer stubbornness, about the years of drought and trouble, and the cattle drives north, about the slow accumulation of everything that made the Hale spread what it was. "Elijah was 23 when William died," Amos said one afternoon, shelling beans with his good hand. "Came home from driving a herd up to Kansas and found his father had passed in his sleep. Just walked into this place and took it over like he had been doing it forever. Never once complained, never once let anything slip." "He seems like a man who knows what he is doing," Lenora said. "He is, but knowing what you are doing and being happy are not the same animal." Amos set down a handful of beans. "He was engaged years back. Girl from San Antonio, a doctor's daughter. Nice enough. But she could not take to the land. 2 years she tried, and then she went back to the city, and that was that." He looked at Lenora with the deliberate casualness of a man who was not being casual at all. "He has not given it another try." Lenora continued chopping onions. "Amos," she said pleasantly, "I notice what you are doing." He laughed and went back to his beans. One afternoon in early May, she was coming back from the kitchen garden carrying a basket of early radishes and spring onions when her path crossed Elijah's near the water pump. He was leading one of the horses, a tall chestnut gelding with a white blaze, and the horse had thrown a shoe and was moving with the careful deliberateness of an animal that was uncomfortable. "Let me look at that foot," she said, setting her basket down. He looked at her with a question in his expression. "My father kept horses," she said. "I know something about feet." He held the gelding's head while she lifted the left forefoot and examined it carefully. The shoe was indeed gone, and the hoof had a small crack beginning at the edge. Not serious, but it wanted attention soon. "He will need the farrier before you work him again," she said, setting the foot down. "Farrier comes Thursday," Elijah said. She picked up her basket. They were standing close, the way you are when you are looking at a horse together, and she was suddenly aware of how quiet it was, the midday lull when the hands were either at the bunkhouse or out on the range, and the ranch had a momentary stillness. "Thank you," he said, "for looking." It was not any trouble. She turned to go. "Mrs. Morgan," he said. She turned back. He was looking at her with an expression that seemed to be working something out. "I want you to know that," he stopped, started again. "The work you are doing here, the men are better for it, the whole place is." He paused. I wanted to say so plainly. Lenora felt warmth in her face that was not from the sun. "Thank you," she said. "That means something to me." She walked back to the cookhouse without looking back, which cost her a small but specific effort. That night she lay in her narrow pantry room and thought, with the honest self-awareness of a woman who had been around long enough to know herself, that she needed to be careful. Elijah Hale was a good man. That was precisely the danger. She had come here to find stability, not complication. She had a dead husband's debts and a broken life, and no business letting her heart form attachments that might make it harder to think clearly. She told herself that firmly. She believed it largely. And then she went to sleep and dreamed about gray eyes. June arrived with heat that settled over the panhandle like a wool blanket left in the sun. The cattle needed moving to the north pasture where there was better grass, and Elijah and his 4 hands Pete Moss, a young fellow named Diego Vargas who was maybe 20 years old and rode like he had been born on horseback, an older man called Taft whose first name nobody seemed to use, and a quiet Comanche man named Runs Ahead who had been with the ranch for 3 years were gone for 5 days driving the herd up. During those 5 days, Lenora and Amos kept the ranch. She repaired a section of the kitchen garden fence that a deer had damaged, reorganized the provisions cupboard, rendered down a batch of tallow for soap, and began rehemming a set of curtains for the main house that Amos told her had been falling apart for 2 years, but that nobody had gotten around to fixing, because nobody in a bunkhouse full of cowboys knew how to use a needle and thread. She had not been in the main house before. Amos took her over to measure the windows, and she moved through the rooms with a quality of attention she recognized in herself as something deeper than professional curiosity. The house was substantial and well-built, and it had bones of genuine character, wide plank floors and high ceilings and windows that let in the afternoon light in long golden rectangles. But it was also achingly sparse, the way a house is when a single man who works all day lives in it alone and has no one to help him see what it could be. The parlor had 2 good chairs and a fireplace with a wooden mantel on which sat a single photograph in a tin frame. A man and a woman, older, formal in the way of photographs from the 1860s, who Lenora recognized as William and Martha Hale from Amos's descriptions. There was a bookshelf that held perhaps 40 books, which was more than she expected, and which made her revise some assumptions she had not quite articulated. There was a dining table that was far too large for one person, with 8 chairs pushed in around it, and a kitchen that was perfectly functional and perfectly unloved. She measured the windows, noted the curtain lengths she would need, and was about to leave when she noticed, on the bookshelf, a copy of Thomas Hardy that she had once owned herself. She almost reached for it before catching herself. She was in a man's house measuring his windows. That was all. She went back to the cookhouse and spent the next 4 days sewing curtains. When the men came back from the cattle drive on the 5th evening, dusty and tired and quiet in the way of men who had done good hard work and knew it, she had a proper meal ready: roasted beef, baked beans, corn bread, and a dried apple pie that she had made on a hopeful impulse that morning. Elijah came into the cookhouse last, after the others had already started eating. He had washed the worst of the dust off his face and hands at the pump, and he looked tired but settled, the way a man looks when he has been doing exactly what he is built for. He sat down, and she set a plate in front of him. "The curtains in the main house," Amos said from his end of the table with the performative innocence of a man starting a fire. Elijah looked up. "What about them? Mrs. Morgan fixed them." Elijah turned to look at her. She was already moving back toward the stove, but she stopped. "You did not have to do that," he said. "I had thread and time," she said. "It was not any trouble." He was looking at her again with that expression. She had begun to recognize the one that meant he was choosing words carefully, because the ones that came naturally were ones he had not yet decided to use. "Thank you," he said. "You are welcome," she said, and returned to the stove before her expression could tell him anything further. Cord Devereaux came back in the 3rd week of June. this time with a colleague from the bank whose name was Harlow. Where Devereaux was smooth, Harlow was blunt, and together they presented Elijah with a document that they claimed amended the original deed terms on the north parcel. Lenora happened to be carrying a pot of coffee across the yard when the three men were speaking near the main house porch, and she heard enough to understand that the bank was making a more serious push. That evening, after supper, Elijah sat at the cookhouse table long after the other men had left. He had a set of papers spread out in front of him, and he was reading them with the concentrated attention of a man who was not a lawyer but was determined to understand what a lawyer would. Lenora cleaned up around him without comment, and then, when she poured her own cup of coffee and sat down at the other end of the table, he looked up. "Can you read legal documents?" he asked. It was not a condescending question. It was practical. "Some," she said. "My husband had debts. I learned to read bank papers out of necessity." He pushed a section of the document toward her. "This part, what do you make of it?" She picked it up and read it through carefully. It concerned a clause about water easements, and the language was deliberately circular, but after reading it twice, she had the shape of it. "They are arguing that this amendment supersedes the original deed," she said. "But this document does not have a proper notary seal. And the date here," she pointed, "is 1879, but the original deed, if I understand correctly, was filed in 1871. An amendment from 1879 would have needed both parties to sign, and I do not see your father's signature on this." Elijah looked at the page. Something shifted in his expression. "No," he said slowly, "you are right. That signature line is blank, which means this document may not be valid." He looked at her for a long, serious moment. "How did you see that?" "I spent a winter reading every document Thomas ever signed, trying to understand how we had lost everything," she said simply. "It teaches a person to look for what is missing." He was quiet for a moment, and she saw something in his face that was new, not the controlled gratitude of a man acknowledging good service, but something more unguarded, something that looked very much like genuine admiration. "Mrs. Morgan," he said, and then stopped. "Lenora," she said, "we have been sharing a cookhouse table for 2 months. I think you can call me Lenora." Something that was almost a smile moved at the corner of his mouth. "Lenora," he said. He said it the way you say a word when you have been waiting to use it and did not realize until now how much you wanted to. "And you are Elijah," she said. "I know your name. Amos says it approximately 40 times a day." This time the smile broke through fully, brief and genuine, and so unexpectedly transformative that she had to look back down at the document to collect herself. "I am riding to Amarillo tomorrow," he said. "I will take this to the lawyer." "Good." He gathered the papers and stood. "Lenora," he said it again like he was confirming it was permitted. "Thank you." She told him good night and listened to his boots on the steps going out. And then she sat alone in the cookhouse with the coffee growing cold in her cup and made the conscious, deliberate decision to feel nothing that she did not have full permission to feel. She was not entirely successful. The trip to Amarillo took 3 days. Elijah went alone, which the hands treated with the pragmatic acceptance of men who understood that their employer was capable of handling his own business. Lenora ran the cookhouse, and Amos, whose wrist was nearly healed, began to help more substantively, and the two of them fell into a comfortable working partnership that was more like friendship than employment. Amos told her things about the ranch, and she told him about Calico Flat and Thomas and the slow education of those 8 years, and they talked while they cooked in the way that people who do physical work together sometimes talk loosely, honestly, without the formal structure that sitting-down conversations carry. "He is a good man, Elijah," Amos said one morning while they were making bread. "A fair man, honest. He needed dough for a moment. A little solitary, always has been, even as a boy. His mother used to say he kept his feelings in his chest pocket like a watch that nobody else was allowed to see." Lenora laughed at that. "I am not matchmaking," Amos said serenely. "That is precisely what you are doing, Amos. I am simply making observations. Your observations have a very particular direction." He smiled at his bread dough and said nothing further, Elijah returned on the third evening with a report that was better than expected. The lawyer had confirmed that the bank's amendment document was invalid. The signature line for the senior Hale was indeed blank, and without it the document had no legal force. The water rights were clear. The north parcel was clear. The bank could come at them again with different paperwork, but the lawyer believed the original deeds were strong and that any future challenge would require a court, and courts generally favored documented history over banking ambition. He told them all at supper, and the table received it with the practical relief of people who depend on a place for their livelihood. Pete Moss said, "Good," and went back to eating. Diego said something in Spanish that sounded approving. Taft grunted. Runs Ahead nodded once. Elijah looked at Lenora across the table and said, "You spotted the problem first. The lawyer said the blank signature was the key." She shook her head. "You would have found it." "Maybe eventually," he said. "Not as quickly." There was a silence that was not uncomfortable, and Pete Moss looked between them with the expression of a man who was going to have a story to tell his wife the next time he rode into town. Later that evening, when she was banking the cookhouse fire for the night, she heard a knock at the cookhouse door. Elijah stood on the step with his hat in his hands, which she had noticed was something he did when he was about to say something that mattered to him. "I wanted to ask you something," he said. "Come in out of the dark," she said. He came in and stood near the table. "There is a social gathering in town on Saturday. The Calico Flat Founders' Day celebration. The town does it every year." He was looking somewhere to the left of her face, which told her this was costing him something. "I thought if you were interested, you might want to ride in with the rest of us. Not as that is, I thought you might enjoy it. The company." He was asking her to go with him to a social event. They both understood this perfectly well, and they both understood that what was happening in this cookhouse was something that was growing whether either of them had intended it or not. "I would like that," she said. He looked at her directly then. "Good," he said. "Good." He put his hat back on and went out, and she allowed herself, in the privacy of the empty cookhouse, a smile that she would not have permitted herself in front of another person. Founders' Day in Calico Flat was a modest affair by the standards of larger towns, but by the standards of the Panhandle, it was something bunting on the general store and the saloon. A fiddler and a caller setting up in the street for dancing in the evening. Pies and preserves and baked goods laid out on a long table outside the church, children running with a joyful indifference to the heat. The bank and the lawyer's office were closed. The hardware store had put a painted sign in its window that said Happy Founders Day in letters that were enthusiastic if not entirely level. They rode in together in the ranch wagon, Elijah driving, Lenora beside him on the bench seat, and Amos in the back because Amos had said he was not going to miss Founders Day for anything. Pete Moss and his wife Clara had ridden in the previous day and were already in town. Diego had gone home to his family's place north of Calico Flat. Taft and Runs Ahead stayed at the ranch to keep an eye on the herd. The wagon ride was 11 miles, and it took the better part of 2 hours. And Lenora spent the first half of it watching the land and the second half of it talking to Elijah Hale in a way that she had not quite done before, not about the ranch or the work or the legal papers, but about everything else. He asked about her childhood, which had been in Missouri, on a farm that was harder than it looked, with a father who was a demanding man but a fair one, and a mother who had died when she was 14, and left a hole in the world that had never quite been filled. She asked about his, and he talked about this land, about growing up on it, about his father teaching him to read cattle and sky and season, about how the ranch was less a possession than a kind of responsibility that had been handed to him, and that he took seriously. He talked more than she had yet heard him talk. His voice was low and steady, and the words came carefully chosen. She had the sense that he did not speak carelessly, and that speaking this much meant something. At some point, she could not afterward have said precisely when, she realized that they had been talking for an hour and 20 minutes without a single pause that was not simply the comfortable breath of two people who did not need to fill every silence with noise. When the rooftops of Calico Flat appeared against the skyline, she felt a particular regret, the way you feel when a good hour ends. In town, they separated for a time. Amos went to find people he knew. Lenora spent a pleasant hour with Hazel Prout, who was delighted to see her and wanted to know everything. And Elijah disappeared in the direction of the hardware store. Clara Moss found her near the food table and embraced her with the warmth of a woman who had been hoping things were going well for Lenora and could see, from something in her face, that they were. "You look well," Clara said, with a specificity that implied she meant more than health. "I am employed," Lenora said carefully. Clara smiled in a way that said she knew the difference between those two things and what she was actually observing. In the evening, when the fiddler started and the caller began calling figures, Elijah found her near the edge of the dancing crowd. He had been standing with a group of ranchers from the southern county, and he had excused himself from them with a purposefulness that was not subtle to anyone watching, though he seemed unaware of this. "Do you dance?" he asked. "I do," she said. "Do you?" "I was taught," he said. "How well I managed is a matter for debate." She laughed and held out her hand. He danced with the same quality he had for everything. Seriously, with a focused attention that turned what might have been merely competent into something that was quietly compelling. He was careful with her, not in the way of a man who thought her fragile, but in the way of a man who was paying close attention to her comfort and her pleasure. And when the music shifted, and the dance brought them closer for a moment, she felt the warmth of him and the careful steadiness of his hand at her back and understood, in the clearest possible terms, that she was in considerable trouble. They danced twice, which was noticed by everyone in a crowd that size, and then they stood together at the edge of the dancing and watched the others and talked, and at some point his shoulder was touching hers and neither of them moved away. Amos found them at 9 o'clock looking like two people who were working very hard at having a casual conversation, and he announced that he was tired and ready to ride back, and the expression on his face as he said this was the most openly satisfied expression Lenora had ever seen on another human being. The ride home was quieter than the ride in, but not because conversation was impossible. It was the quietness of a different kind of awareness. The sky over the panhandle at night in early summer was extraordinary black as ink, and so full of stars that the weight of them seemed to press down with a physical gentleness. Elijah drove slowly and without apparent hurry, and Amos had fallen asleep in the back within 20 minutes and was snoring with complete commitment. "I have not danced in 4 years, Lenora said, somewhere in the 7th mile. "Was it tonight your first time since Thomas died?" "Yes." "Did it feel strange?" She considered this honestly. "It felt like something that had been sleeping starting to wake up," she said, "which is strange in its own way." He was quiet for a moment. "I understand that," he said. She looked at his profile in the dark, the straight line of his nose, the set of his jaw, the way he held the reins with the easy authority of a man who had been handling horses since before he could read. "Elijah," she said. "Yes." "I do not know what this is," she said. She had always been direct, even when directness cost her something. "Between us, whatever has been growing," she kept her voice steady. "But I want you to know that I am not looking for someone to take care of me. I can take care of myself. I have been doing it." He kept his eyes on the road. "I know that. I am not looking to complicate your life, Lenora." He said her name with the gravity of someone stopping a conversation before it goes in a wrong direction. "You are not complicating anything." He looked at her then briefly and then back at the road. "The complication would be pretending I have not noticed you since the day you knocked on my bunkhouse door." She was quiet. "I am also not the kind of man who talks more than he means," he said. "So I will not say more than that yet, but I wanted you to know." She sat with that for a mile, the wagon rolling through the dark and the stars burning overhead and Amos snoring peacefully behind them. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "Thank you for asking." When they reached the ranch and Amos woke himself up with a particularly loud snore, and climbed down from the wagon with the affected innocence of a man who had definitely been listening for the last several miles. Lenora said good night to them both and walked to the cookhouse. She lay in her small room and felt, for the first time in a very long while, something that was too specific and alive and present to be called hope. She was not sure yet what it was. But it was there, warm and real in the center of her chest, and she let herself feel it without immediately building a wall around it. July came in with a heat that was serious but not cruel, and the ranch moved through it with the steady industriousness of a well-run operation. The calves from spring were growing well, the cattle in the north pasture were doing what cattle do, and the legal problem with the bank had remained quiet since Elijah's trip to Amarillo. There was a quality to life at the Hale ranch that Lenora had not fully appreciated until she had been there long enough to feel it in her bones. A stability, an order, a sense that things were tended and cared for by someone who understood what he had been given and what it required. Between her and Elijah, things were changing with the deliberate inevitability of seasons, unmistakably, but at the pace of something that is doing it right rather than quickly. He had taken to stopping by the cookhouse in the evenings after the men had eaten and gone, not always to talk, sometimes just to sit at the table with coffee while she put the kitchen to rights, and the silence they kept in those moments was a kind of conversation all its own. He began to show her the ranch in a way that was beyond her professional need for it, taking her on Sunday afternoons to the north pasture, to the ridge above the creek where you could see the whole spread laid out below, to the old homestead site where his father had first built a one-room structure that still stood in the far corner of the east field, weathered down to the color of old bone but structurally intact. He lived here 4 years before he built the main house, Elijah said, standing beside her at the door of the original structure. By himself the first 2 years, then with my mother. It is smaller than I expected for a man of his ambitions, she said. He always said you build what you need before you build what you want, Elijah said. Though I think by the time he built the main house it was mostly for my mother. She deserved a proper house. Lenora stepped inside. The interior was stripped of furnishings, just the raw boards of the floor and the walls, a stone fireplace blackened by a decade of fires that were long cold. There was a single window cut into the west wall, and the afternoon light came through it in a long slant that caught the dust moving in the air. "It is a good house," she said. "It was a good beginning." She turned and found him watching her in that way he had, the attentive, careful way that had gradually shifted over weeks from the guarded attention of an employer to something that was undisguised in its warmth. "Lenora," he said. "Yes. I would like to court you," he said. He said it exactly like that, plainly, with the same honesty he brought to everything. "Properly, if you are willing." She felt the warmth in her face and did not try to hide it. "I am willing," she said. He let out a breath that might have been relief, and she understood then that it had cost him something to say it, that this was a man who had been disappointed before, and who did not offer the real things easily. "I want to be clear about my intentions," he said. "I am not a man who courts without meaning it." "I know," she said. "That is partly why I said yes." He held out his hand and she took it, and he held it with a careful, gentle sureness that made her understand that he meant to keep her if she would let him, and that he was asking permission rather than assuming. She squeezed his hand once, and they stood in the old homestead in the afternoon light, and it was a moment she knew she would keep for the rest of her life. Courting, in the summer of 1882 on the Texas panhandle, looked different from what it might look like in a city or even in a larger town. There were no parlor calls with a chaperone sitting in the corner, no formal calling cards, no elaborate protocols. There was a ranch to run, animals to tend, work to do. Their courtship happened in the margins of work, in the long evenings on the porch when he would sit in one of the wooden chairs, and she would sit in the other, and they would watch the last light leave the sky, in the Sunday afternoon rides across the property, in the conversations at the cookhouse table that went later and later into the evening as the summer wore on. He was, she discovered, a man of unexpected depths. He had read widely for someone so far removed from any kind of formal education after his early years. His father had believed in books and had accumulated them, and Elijah had read everything in the house and anything else he could lay hands on, with the same thorough attention he brought to everything. He had opinions about things she had not expected him to have opinions about. He made her laugh with a dry, quiet humor that revealed itself so gradually that every new instance of it was a small, specific gift. She told him about Missouri, about her childhood, about the father who had been difficult to love and the mother who had been easy to lose, about the girl she had been and the women she had become. She told him about Thomas honestly, without sanitizing it, that Thomas had been a man of good intentions and poor judgment, that she had loved him and frustrated with him and mourned him, that her grief was real but uncomplicated by the kind of passion that might have made it harder. He listened to all of it without interruption and without trying to fix it, which was exactly what she needed. He told her about the engagement that had ended, the woman from San Antonio named Margaret who had tried for 2 years to make a life in this place and found that she could not, and that it had not been anyone's fault but simply a misalignment between a person and a landscape, a life and a need, that no amount of good intention could bridge. "Did you love her?" Lenora asked. "I thought I did," he said. "I think now I loved the idea of having a companion more than I understood the particular person I had chosen. That is a very honest thing to say." "She would agree with it," he said. "She is married now to a man in San Antonio who owns a pharmacy. She is happy. I am glad of it." They were sitting on the porch of the main house as he said this, which had become a place they ended up in the evenings. She had begun to spend an hour or two in the main house each week, putting it into better order in a way that she told herself was simply a practical extension of her domestic work, but that was also undeniably a way of making herself more present in the life of the man she was falling in love with. She had not yet said that to herself so plainly. She said it now, in the privacy of her own thoughts, sitting on the main house porch with the evening coming down and the cattle calling out in the distance, and Elijah's shoulder 3 inches from hers. She was falling in love with him. She was, in fact, already there. The question was what to do with that. The answer arrived in August. On a Saturday afternoon in the 3rd week of August, Cord Devereaux came back. He came alone this time without his colleague Harlow, and he came not to the main house but to the cookhouse where Lenora was working. He came while Elijah and the hands were out checking the south fence, which had been reported damaged by a spooked steer, and the ranch yard was quiet. Devereaux knocked and she opened the door, and she saw immediately from his expression that this was a different kind of visit from the professional ones. "Mrs. Morgan," he said with a smile that was specifically designed to be charming, "I understand you have been a useful hand to Mr. Hale in the matter of his legal documents." She kept her expression neutral. "I am a cook," she said. "Of course," he said. He was looking past her into the cookhouse. "I wonder if I might have a word with you, privately." She kept the door at a half-open angle and did not invite him in. "You can say what you need to say from there." Something flickered in his expression, irritation, quickly smoothed. "I want you to understand," he said, "that the bank has considerable interests in this region. Mr. Hale's cooperation would be beneficial for everyone. If you were to encourage him to reconsider his position on the North Parcel matter, I believe arrangements could be made that would be financially advantageous." She understood him precisely. He was attempting to use her as leverage. He believed, apparently, that because she was employed here and living here and therefore in a position that might seem precarious, she would be susceptible to financial inducement or pressure. "Mr. Devereaux," she said, with the same steady directness she brought to everything, "I am going to tell you plainly that I have no interest in anything you are suggesting. And I am also going to tell you that if you return to this property for anything other than business properly conducted with Mr. Hale at the main house, I will tell him precisely what you said to me today, and I believe you know that will end whatever professional relationship you have been attempting to maintain." Devereaux's smooth expression broke for a moment into something sharper and less pleasant. "You are making a mistake," he said. "I have made mistakes in my life," she said. "You are not one of them." She closed the door. Her hands were shaking slightly, which she acknowledged and then set aside. She went to the window and watched until Devereaux's horse moved back down the road, and then she sat down at the cookhouse table and breathed carefully until she was settled. When Elijah came back, she told him immediately and in full detail. His face went very still as she talked, in the way she had learned meant he was controlling a strong feeling. When she finished, he said, "You are sure he was suggesting what you understood him to be suggesting?" "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "You handled that well, better than I might have in your position." "I had no interest in protecting his feelings," she said simply. He looked at her. "I am going to ride to Amarillo on Monday. I want this on record with the lawyer, and I am going to write to the bank's main office in Dallas. Devereaux has overstepped in a way that the bank itself would not sanction, I suspect." "That is the right approach," she said. He was still for a moment, looking at her with an expression that was open in a way she did not always see from him. "Lenora," he said, "are you all right?" She was touched, more than she expected, by the specific quality of his concern, not for the legal matter but for her. "I am," she said. "He unsettled me for a moment, but I am perfectly all right." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, briefly and with great care. "Good," he said. "I am glad." The hand contact lasted perhaps 5 seconds. It was the most he had touched her since he had held her hand in the old homestead, but it carried an entire conversation in it, and she felt the warmth of it long after he had taken his hand back. Elijah rode to Amarillo on Monday, returned on Wednesday, and reported that the lawyer had indeed found evidence that Devereaux had been operating outside his official capacity from the bank. The bank's manager in Amarillo, apparently not having been informed of Devereaux's extracurricular methods, was sufficiently alarmed to send a letter of formal apology and to confirm that the bank had no further claim on the north parcel or the water rights. Devereaux, it was implied, would be having a professional difficulty. The legal cloud that had been hanging over the Hale ranch since June cleared away in the 3rd week of August like a storm that had finally decided to go bother someone else. That evening, Elijah came to the cookhouse after supper with a bottle of whiskey that he had apparently been keeping for a suitable occasion, and he poured 2 small glasses and set one in front of her and said, "To clear deeds." She picked up her glass. "To clear deeds," she agreed. They drank, and he looked at her over the rim of his glass with the warm gray eyes that had become, she realized, one of the things she looked for first when she came into a room. "I want to show you something on Sunday," he said. "What?" "You will see on Sunday." She had learned over these months that when Elijah Hale said he wanted to show you something, he meant it as a gift. Sunday came with a soft, clear morning, the kind that September was beginning to promise as the heat stepped back. He had saddled a horse for her, one of the gentler mares, a dun-colored animal named Clover who had a smooth gait and agreeable disposition, and they rode north past the cattle pasture, past the creek with its cottonwoods just beginning to show the first pale yellow of the coming season change, up onto the long, shallow ridge that overlooked the whole of the Hale spread. From the ridge, in the morning light, the ranch was laid out below them with the clarity of something that had been planned and built and tended with purpose. The main house with its long porch and the cookhouse beside it, the barn, the corrals, the bunkhouse. The north pasture with the cattle moving in the distance like slow, dark shapes against the pale grass, the creek winding through the cottonwoods, the south field going to yellow, the road running east toward the invisible horizon where Calico Flat waited. "My father stood here the first time when there was nothing but grass," Elijah said. "He told me once that he looked at it and thought, 'This is mine to make something of,' not in a greedy way, in a responsible way, like the land had asked something of him specifically." She looked at the view and understood more fully than she had yet what this place meant to him and what caring for it cost. "He did make something of it," she said. He started it, Elijah said. I am continuing it. He paused. I would like to think that someone will continue it after me, that it will be a home, a real one, not just a working ranch. She looked at him. He looked at her. He had not prepared a speech. She understood this from his expression. He was not a man who prepared speeches. He was a man who waited until the right moment and then said the true thing. Lenora, he said, I love you. I have for some time, and I have been sitting with it long enough to be entirely sure of it. He paused. I know you came here looking for work and not for anything else. I know that you have built a life here that is yours on your own terms, and I do not want to ask you to change that. But I would like to ask you if you are willing to make it bigger, to let this place be yours too, not just the cookhouse, the main house, the whole of it. She felt tears that she had not expected, and she did not blink them away because they were the right kind. I love you too, she said. I have been trying not to for approximately 4 months, and I would like to stop trying now. He made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a breath of relief, and then he reached out and took her hand and held it the way he had held it in the old homestead, with that careful sureness that asked permission and gave steadiness all at once. Will you marry me? He said. Yes, she said. It was the simplest and most entirely certain yes she had ever spoken. He squeezed her hand. They sat on the ridge with the ranch spread out below them and the sky enormous above, and the cottonwoods beginning their turn toward autumn, and she let herself feel the full size of what was happening, not because she had come looking for it, but because she had been looking for survival and had found something larger and better than she had been hoping for, and she was not going to treat that lightly. I want to be married here, he said. On the ranch. Yes, she said again. She seemed to have run out of more complicated words, and she thought that was appropriate. They rode back down to the ranch in the soft morning, their horses walking close, and she caught Diego watching them from the corral fence with an expression of undisguised joy on his young face, and Amos standing on the cookhouse steps with his recovered wrist folded across his chest, and a look of absolute serene satisfaction, and Pete Moss attempting to look like he had not been watching the ridge for the past 2 hours and failing completely. Runs Ahead, who was a man of few words and great accuracy, looked at them as they rode into the yard, looked at their joined hands as they dismounted, and said simply, "Good," and went back to what he was doing. Elijah squeezed her hand one more time and let it go, and they went about the day's work with the particular quiet happiness of 2 people who have just put the most important decision of their lives to rest and can now simply live inside it. They were married in October, before the cold came down from the north, on the front porch of the main house. The porch had been cleaned and hung with the only decorative items available to a working ranch, which turned out to be surprisingly sufficient. Amos had found a length of calico in the provisions cupboard that Lenora fashioned into a kind of bunting, and Clara Moss brought wildflowers she had pressed and dried in late summer that arranged themselves in tin cups along the railing with unexpected charm. Pete Moss had carved a small wooden cross that hung from the porch post. Diego's mother and 2 sisters had ridden down from the north and brought tamales and sweet corn cake, which were contributions that caused Amos and Lenora both to declare the reception menu officially improved. The minister came from Calico Flat, a patient and earnest man named Reverend Okafor, who had been in the town for 3 years and had the distinction of being both the area's only minister and one of its better horsemen. He had been born in Virginia and had made his way west with the same drive as anyone else, and he spoke the words of the ceremony in a voice that filled the outdoor air without straining. Lenora wore her best dress, which was a dark green calico she had made herself in the evenings over the previous 3 weeks, with a proper collar and cuffs, and enough care given to the skirt that it fell exactly as it should. She had pinned her hair up with a small silver pin that had been her mother's, and that she had carried in the bottom of the carpetbag since the day she left Missouri. Elijah wore a suit that Amos revealed had been stored in a trunk in the main house for years, waiting, Amos said with magnificent composure, for exactly this occasion. It fit Elijah perfectly, which meant either that he and his father had been built similarly, or that Amos was better at planning ahead than anyone had given him credit for. When Reverend Achafer reached the vows, Elijah turned to her and held both of her hands in his, and he said them with the steady, clear honesty that characterized everything he did. And she said them back with the same honesty, and she meant every syllable from the first to the last. When Reverend Achafer said that Elijah could kiss his bride, there was a moment before he did so when he looked at her with those gray eyes warm and entirely open, no glass between them and what was in his chest, and she saw everything in that look, the years of solitude and the careful hope, and the particular gratitude of a man who had not expected to be this lucky. And she felt a corresponding fullness in herself that she recognized as the right-shaped happiness, the kind that is built from real material rather than wishful thinking. He kissed her gently and then held her close for a moment that the whole small crowd on the porch and the yard let go by in silence, because some moments ask for that. Then Diego's mother announced that the food was ready, and the moment became a celebration, and the Texas afternoon came down around them in long gold light, and they ate tamales and sweet corn cake and biscuits and roasted beef, and the fiddler that Pete Moss had somehow arranged arrived just before sunset and played until it was too dark to dance. After the guests had eaten and talked and the evening had begun to settle toward night, Lenora stood for a moment at the edge of the porch watching the last color leave the sky, and Elijah came to stand beside her. He held out a folded piece of paper. She looked at him. "The deed," he said. "I had the lawyer add your name to it when I was in Amarillo. It should have been done when we became engaged, and I did not think of it until last week." He paused. "This place is yours, Lenora. As much mine as yours from today." She took the paper and unfolded it. It was the deed to the main house and the property, and there at the top, in the clear formal hand of a county clerk, were the names, Elijah Hale and Lenora Hale, her new name printed plainly in the official record of the land. She folded it carefully and held it in both hands. "Lenora Hale," she said, trying it out loud for the first time. "It suits you," he said. "It does," she agreed. He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him, and they stood on the porch of the main house that was now officially as much hers as his, with the stars coming on above the panhandle one by one, and the ranch settled and quiet around them, and the new life they were beginning together stretching out ahead of them like good open land. The first winter of their marriage was one Lenora would remember as one of the most contented of her life, which surprised her, because contentment had not been something she associated with winter in Texas. The ranch in winter required a different kind of labor, maintaining the herd through the cold snaps that came down from the northern plains, keeping the water sources open, managing the feed that had been put up in the barn through summer and fall. Elijah was up before dawn every day and out with the hands until the light was gone, and Lenora ran the household with the same competence she had brought to the cookhouse, but now in the full space of the main house, which she was making slowly, practically, with the pleasure of a woman who had been without a proper home for a year and knew what one was worth, into something that was genuinely warm and lived in. She brought books to the shelves and organized them by subject. She put a proper rag rug in front of the parlor fireplace that she had made herself from worn clothing cut into strips. She planted bulbs in the kitchen garden that she knew would come up in spring, daffodils and crocuses, because she intended to be here in spring to see them. She set the long dining table with a proper cloth on Sundays when she cooked dinner for the hands and for Amos, who had become as close to family as anyone at the table, and the main house became what a main house on a ranch ought to be, a center, a warmth, a place that the people around it oriented themselves toward. Elijah watched all of this with a quiet steadiness of joy that he expressed in small, consistent ways, coming home in the evenings, and taking off his coat, and sitting at the parlor table near the fire with a book while she read or sewed, without needing the space to be filled with talk, bringing her a cup of tea at exactly the right moment when she was working on something complicated. looking at her sometimes across a room or a table with an expression that made her feel thoroughly known and thoroughly valued, which was not a combination she had previously experienced. "You are happy," Amos observed one afternoon in the cookhouse, where Lenora still worked her mornings because she had decided she enjoyed it and because a working ranch needed a working kitchen. "I am," she said simply. "Good," he said, and meant it in the large way he always meant things. In February, she told Elijah that she was expecting. He received the news in the manner she had come to expect from him, with stillness first, and then, when he had absorbed it, with a kind of warmth that started in his expression and worked its way through his entire bearing. He said, "Are you well? Are you feeling all right?" "I feel perfectly well," she said. "Little tired in the mornings, but otherwise very well." He crossed the kitchen and held her face in his hands and kissed her in a way that was very different from the careful, measured first kiss on the wedding porch, with a fullness and a gratitude that made her feel the specific weight and importance of the moment they were in. "I did not think," he said, and stopped. "You thought you were going to do all of this alone," she said. He looked at her. "Yes." "You are not," she said. "No," he said. "I am not." He pressed his forehead to hers for a moment, and she put her hand on his chest where she could feel his heartbeat, steady and strong. The spring brought the daffodils up in the kitchen garden exactly as she had planted them, bright yellow against the dark earth, and Lenora stood at the window one morning looking at them with a particular private satisfaction. Runs ahead, passing the kitchen window with a coil of rope over his shoulder, saw her looking and looked at what she was looking at and said, through the glass, without stopping, "Good planting," and continued on his way. She laughed and thought that she was becoming, in the only way that genuinely mattered, entirely at home. The baby came in October, 1 year and 2 days after the wedding, arriving with the brisk efficiency of someone who had made up his mind about his timing and was not to be argued with. He was a boy, healthy and loud, and possessed of a strong set of opinions about what he wanted, which was primarily food and his mother's presence, and as he grew through the autumn and into winter, the sound of his father's voice. They named him William Elijah Hale, after the grandfather who had stood on a ridge and looked at open grass and seen a life worth building. William Sr.'s photograph on the parlor mantel seemed, in the particular light of the afternoon the baby was named, to approve. Amos held the baby on the afternoon of the third day with the careful reverence of a man who understood the weight of a thing being entrusted to him, and said, "Well, William, you chose well," and everyone in the room understood that he was talking to the baby about the family he had been born into. Pete Moss shook Elijah's hand with a grip that communicated everything men who do not talk much need to communicate. Diego was delighted in the open, wholehearted way of a young man who had grown up in a large family and understood children as something joyful rather than burdensome. Taft, who had never been observed to express any emotion more complex than mild satisfaction, was found on the day of young William's birth sitting on the corral fence with his hat in his hands, and a look on his face that could only be described as moved. Runs Ahead appeared at the main house door on the second day with a small carved horse in polished dark wood that he had made himself, and he set it on the windowsill near the baby's crib without explanation and left. It stood there afterward as a permanent feature of the room, smooth and beautiful and quietly made. Lenora, lying in the bedroom with the baby at her side, and the afternoon light coming through the curtain she had rehemmed in that first empty week on the ranch, felt the completeness of what had happened to her with a clarity so strong it was almost like a physical sensation. She had come here with a carpetbag and a dead husband's debts, looking for work. She had knocked on a bunkhouse door. She was now Lenora Hale. Her name was on the deed to the main house. The room she lay in was hers. The land outside was hers. The man who came through the door now with the quiet step of someone who had been moving carefully for 2 days in consideration of her rest, and who sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her and the baby with gray eyes that were wide open to everything he felt he was hers. She reached up and touched his face. "Hello," he said softly. "Hello," she said. Young William opened his eyes at the sound of his father's voice and made a small sound that could reasonably be interpreted as acknowledgement. "He knows you," she said. Elijah put one finger against the baby's palm and felt the small fingers close around it, and the expression on his face was one that she stored carefully in the most protected part of her memory. "I will not let him down," he said. "I know," she said. She turned her face against his hand, and outside the window the October wind moved through the cottonwoods along the creek, now fully yellow, and the cattle called from the north pasture, and the Hale ranch continued its steady, purposeful turning beneath the enormous Texas sky. 3 years passed with the full texture of lived time. Young William grew into a child who had his father's gray eyes and his mother's direct, steady nature, and who had the particular fearlessness of a child raised on a working ranch where horses and cattle and the changeable sky were simply the ordinary furniture of life. By the time he was 2, he was regularly found sitting on the corral fence beside Taft, both of them watching the horses with identical expressions of concentrated attention. By the time he was 3, he had a wooden horse of his own that he rode in the kitchen with noises that he believed were convincing. The ranch in those years was doing well. Elijah had added a small herd of quality horses to the operation, a calculated expansion that had been his plan for several years, and that he had been able to fund through 3 good cattle seasons. Diego had become the best horseman on the ranch, and had been promoted to a position of genuine authority that suited him, and made him more permanently at home at the Hale spread than he had previously been. Pete and Clara Moss's daughter was born in the spring of the 2nd year, and the 2 families became what people in ranch country become when they work together long enough, not quite family, but the next thing closest to it. Amos, in those years, was slowing. His wrist had healed, but his knees had not been as cooperative, and by the end of the 2nd year, he had handed the cookhouse work entirely to Lenora, and settled into the role of advisor and general household presence, with an equanimity that said he had been waiting for exactly this retirement, and had only needed the right situation to retire into. He ate at the main house table on Sundays with the settled comfort of belonging, and told young William stories about his grandfather William Hale with a fidelity to detail that made the old man real to the child in a way that a photograph alone never could. In the spring of the 4th year, Lenora told Elijah they were expecting again. He received it this time without the stillness, instead with immediate and uncomplicated joy, sweeping her off her feet in the kitchen in a way that made her laugh out loud, and young William, who was watching from the doorway, shout, "Again! Again!" under the impression that this was a game. The 2nd child arrived in November, a girl this time, with dark hair and lungs that registered strong objection to the temperature of the world she had entered. They named her Martha, for the grandmother on the mantle, and she came into the household like a weather event, vivid and irresistible, and making immediate changes to the schedule. Young William took his role as elder sibling with a seriousness that Elijah told Lenora privately was the funniest thing he had seen, because the child was 3 and his sister was 3 days old, and he was already attempting to supervise. "He is yours," Elijah said. "He has your capacity for responsibility," she returned. He kissed her temple. "We are going to raise remarkable people." "We already are," she said, looking at young William sitting importantly beside the baby's crib. The winter of that year was the coldest in recent memory. The north wind came down hard in January and stayed for 3 weeks, driving the temperature to extremes that tested the herd and the buildings and the people. Elijah and the hands were working in conditions that were genuinely difficult, and Lenora kept the main house warm and the cookhouse going and made sure everyone who came in from the cold had something hot to eat and somewhere warm to sit. On the worst night of the cold snap, when the wind was hitting the main house with a force that made the windows rattle, Elijah came in from the barn at midnight, having stayed to make sure the animals were properly secured and settled. He was cold down to his bones, his coat white with frost at the collar, and she had a fire up and hot coffee waiting, and she helped him out of the coat and boots and sat him by the fire. He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup and looked at her across the firelight. "I have been thinking," he said, through the last of the cold. "About what?" "About how this place was a working ranch before you came," he said. "Functioning, orderly, productive." He looked at her steadily. "And what it is now." "Which is all of that and also a home, a real one." He paused. "I did not know the difference before. I thought I had what I needed." "We often do not know what we are missing," she said gently. "No," he said, "we do not." He reached across and took her hand. "I am grateful every day that you knocked on my bunkhouse door," she smiled. "I was looking for work." "I know," he said, and the warmth in his expression carried the entire arc of what that had led to. "I am glad I had some to offer." "So am I," she said. Outside, the north wind pushed against the walls of the main house, and the fire threw its warm light, and young William slept in his room dreaming of horses, and baby Martha slept in her crib with the wooden horse runs ahead had carved on the windowsill above her, and the deed in the desk drawer in the parlor had 2 names on it, and the man sitting by the fire with her hand in his had the last name she carried, and all of it. The work and the loss that had brought her here, and the fear, and the courage, and the love that had grown from the most practical of beginnings, all of it had been worth it and more. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He rested his cheek against her hair. The wind did its work outside. The fire did its work inside. And Lenora Hale, who had arrived at a bunkhouse door in the spring of 1882 with a carpetbag and a will to survive, sat in the warmth of everything she had built and let herself be, completely and without reservation, at home. In the years that followed, the Hale Ranch became known throughout the county as one of the finest operations on the panhandle. Not for its size alone, though it grew modestly as Elijah bought a neighboring parcel in 1886 when old man Gaffney retired and went east to live with his daughter, but for the quality of the cattle and the horses, and for the reliability and fairness with which it was run. It became known for something else, too, which was harder to put into practical terms but which people in ranch country understood. When a young couple came through Calico Flat in 1887 looking for work, it was to the Hale Ranch that Burl Watkins's son, who ran the general store now, his father having passed in 1885, sent them, because the Hale Ranch was a place where people were treated with dignity and paid honestly, and given the chance to build something of their own. Lenora ran the kitchen and the household and the kitchen garden, which had expanded over the years into a genuine kitchen garden of some ambition, with raised beds for the vegetables and a small orchard of apple trees she had planted in 1885 from seedlings brought up from Amarillo. She taught young William to read at the kitchen table with the same thoroughness her mother had used in Missouri, and she taught Martha everything she knew about plants and cooking, and the practical arts of keeping a household well. She also taught her daughter something that she had learned the hard way, which was that independence and love were not opposites, and that a woman who knew her own value was the foundation of a partnership rather than an obstacle to it. She said this not in any formal lesson but in the way she lived, in the way she took her place at the ranch not as a dependent but as a full and equal presence, in the way she and Elijah made decisions together about the land and the herd and the future with a mutual respect that was visible to everyone who spent any time at the Hale spread. Elijah, for his part, was fond of pointing out, to anyone who would listen, and with the particular satisfaction of a man who has been very right about something that mattered, that his wife had spotted the fatal flaw in the bank's fraudulent amendment document before any lawyer had seen it, and that this single observation had likely saved the ranch from years of legal difficulty. He said it without pride on his own behalf, and with obvious pride on hers, which was, Lenora thought, the best possible way to tell a story. Amos passed in the winter of 1888, quietly in his sleep, in the room off the cookhouse that had once been Lenora's pantry bedroom. He had asked to stay there rather than move to the main house, saying that he preferred to be close to where the cooking happened. And Lenora had understood that what he meant was that he wanted to stay close to the life of the place he had given most of his years to. He left behind a collection of cooking wisdom that she had written down in a notebook over the years, and a set of cast iron pans that she kept hanging above the stove long after any practical necessity for all of them had passed, because they were his and the kitchen was a better place for their presence. They buried him on the ranch, in the corner of the east field near the old homestead, with a marker that Elijah carved himself from good oak, and Reverend Acafer came from Calico Flat, older now and a little slower but still the best horseman in the county, and spoke words over him that were honest and warm and exactly right. Young William, who was 6, stood at the graveside with the serious composure of a child who understands something important is happening and is trying to be worthy of it. He held Lenora's hand with a grip that said he understood that she was losing someone significant and that he intended to be present with her in that. She looked at him and saw, in his gray eyes and his set jaw and his careful attention to the feelings of the people around him, the best parts of both of his parents. In the years after Amos passed, the ranch settled into the character that would define it for generations. Runs Ahead eventually left to return to his own people in 1889, and Elijah and Lenora said goodbye to him, with the genuine sorrow of people losing something they valued, and the clear-eyed acknowledgement that his life was his own to live, and that he owed them nothing he had not already more than paid. He left the ranch as he had conducted himself in it, with quiet dignity and without ceremony, and the wooden horse he had carved remained on the windowsill in Martha's room, polished now by years of small hands. Taft retired in 1890 and went to live with his sister in New Mexico, departing with the same minimalism that had characterized his 11 years at the ranch. One brief handshake with Elijah, one brief nod to Lenora, and he was on his horse and gone over the ridge. Diego stayed. Diego, who had come to the ranch at 20 as a hand and was now 30, had become the foreman in practice if not immediately in title. A fact that Elijah corrected officially in 1889 with a conversation and a wage adjustment that Diego received with a quiet pride that said he had been hoping for exactly this. He had married a woman named Rosa from Calico Flat in 1887 and built a small house on the eastern edge of the property with Elijah's blessing, and the Vargas household became a permanent and cherished piece of the Hale ranch's human landscape. Rosa and Lenora became friends in the genuine, sustained way of women who respect each other's capabilities, working in adjacent kitchens, trading produce from their respective gardens, raising their children in close enough proximity that young William Hale and Diego's eldest son, a boy named Mateo, grew up with the easy familiarity of people who have known each other since before they could walk. The legal troubles with the Amarillo Bank resolved permanently in 1888 when the bank itself changed hands, and the new ownership, taking stock of the previous management's more creative interpretations of property law, sent a formal letter of settlement that cleared every remaining question about the Hale deeds. Elijah filed it in the same desk drawer as the deed, and Lenora found him reading it one evening in the parlor with an expression of deep and final satisfaction. "Done," he said. "Done," she agreed. He folded it and put it back in the drawer, and that was the end of it. By 1891, young William was 9 and Martha was 6, and the Hale ranch was thriving, and Lenora stood one April morning in the kitchen garden among the daffodils that had come up again. 10 springs they had come up now, from those first bulbs she had planted in her first winter as a married woman, and felt the life she had built around her with a pleasure that was deep and specific. She had come here with a carpetbag. She had left the bunkhouse with a pantry room and a chance. She had, in the fullness of the years, the deed to the main house, and the name of the man she loved, and 2 children who would carry both forward. She had friends and work she was good at, and a kitchen garden she could be proud of, and a husband who looked at her, after 9 years, with the same open warmth of a man who has not yet gotten over the particular good fortune of his own life. Elijah came into the garden that April morning with a cup of coffee in each hand, moving through the daffodils without watching his feet, because he had been doing it long enough to know where they were. And he handed her a cup and stood beside her in the morning quiet. "The apple trees are going to bloom early," he said. "I know," she said. "I have been watching them." They stood together among the flowers, in the garden she had planted on purpose and on hope, and the ranch moved around them, the sounds of horses in the corral and cattle in the distance and Diego calling something to Mateo across the yard, and the voices of William and Martha playing somewhere beyond the barn. "I have been thinking," Elijah said. "About what?" "About the fact that I would like to live here for another 40 years, he said. He looked at her sideways, with the smile she had been collecting for 9 years, the one that changed the whole shape of his face. "If you are agreeable." She looked at the apple trees with their swelling buds, and the daffodils, and the main house behind them with its long porch and its second-floor window, catching the morning light exactly as it had caught it on the day she had first come up this road in Burl Watkins's wagon, looking for work and finding something that turned out to be so much larger than what she had been looking for. "I am very agreeable," she said. She leaned into him, and he put his arm around her, and they stood in the April morning and drank their coffee and watched the Hale Ranch wake up into another day. A day of work and children and animals and good ground, and all the ordinary, extraordinary wealth of a life built well on a foundation of honesty and choice, and the kind of love that comes quietly, without announcement and stays.